Welcome to European Union Governance and Policy Challenges, an online training from the University of Washington. This training was co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and was produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. Welcome to the 2025 update to our lecture on migration and immigration policy issues in the European Union. I'm really excited to have a chance to kind of go through some of the new aspects and the changes since we recorded the original lecture and background, and to work through this with you over the next little chunk of time. So thanks for joining us today. The 2025 update is going to contain a bunch of new things, and then it'll have a section in the middle that's the background information that hasn't changed. So if you've seen the old lecture, you'll see some familiar slides and info as we kind of talk about the history of migration and immigration and what's gone on in the past. There's obviously this new introduction section. You'll see the same background sections you've seen. Then we've got an updated discussion, a bunch of information on what's been going on in the recent years and that experience. The Ukraine war, obviously, and Russian aggression there has been a huge change and a profoundly influential experience in European migration and the EU's engagement with that. We'll talk quite a bit about the temporary protection regime that the EU has set up for refugees and other visitors from the Ukrainian war and what's been offered there. We'll talk about integration opportunities and challenges with the immigrants from the 2010s crises that we discussed along the way, and kind of how that's going in places where challenges are showing up and some of the things that are being done to help address that as it goes forward. And then a somewhat lengthier discussion of what's coming down the road and what remains as we look forward to the change of the EU really becoming a much more fundamental immigration state than it's used to being in history. So thanks so much, and let's kind of go ahead and dive in.
So immigration and migration are long-standing challenging issues for the European continent as a whole. And we'll kind of start way back and roll our way forward a little bit. It's worth noting that in the entire period from 1500 to 1800, something like 1.5 million Europeans left for the New World. It's a shockingly small number relative to how we tend to think about European immigration to the Americas or emigration from Europe. And obviously they left for a wide variety of reasons. But ultimately, the history of Europe, at least the modern history of Europe, until the last 40 years or so, has been one of Europe as emigration states, a place that people left, whether because of war, conflict, famine, ethnic issues, or simply a view of better opportunities going forward. And most of this was unregulated up until roughly 1900, just kind of call that as a good point. There was passport-free travel. You could just pick up and move wherever you wanted in Europe across national borders to any place where the people would be, vaguely welcoming you when you arrived. There was very little official control of movement until the First World War. And similarly, the US had absolutely open borders, no controls on immigration whatsoever. If you could make it across into US territory, you could live here until 1882. And so sort of the entire idea of trying to control immigration, emigration, migration is a relatively recent idea. We then look at the second phase of emigration from Europe to the Americas. And 1815 to 1932 is kind of the most common period. And there the number is something like 60 million Europeans left the European continent. And so from the end of the Napoleonic Wars until the interwar period, or kind of maybe the pre-Second World War period, 60 million Europeans departed. About half of those came to the US and the rest to other places in North America or Australia. About 70% of that number is to North America. So a heavy, heavy focus there. Um, there was a really interesting presentation, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago now. The president of Ireland came to the UW, and she wanted to make the point that that year was the first time in 400 years that Ireland was a net immigration country instead of a net emigration country. The first time in 400 years that Ireland had enough jobs and enough economic opportunity to be a destination rather than a point of departure. And I thought that was a fascinating point about just how Ireland thinks of itself and how these countries must have imagined themselves to all of a sudden be a destination instead of a point of departure. Um, Citizenship, particularly for people used to the American model, globally, citizenship is a really complicated topic. And you may have run into the terms jus sanguinis or jus soli before. Uh, Jus sanguinis, essentially means law of the blood, and jus soli is law of the soil. Um, and there are two forms of citizenship. We're used to here in the US, jus soli, where your citizenship is based on where you were born, the soil that you were born upon. If you're born in the US, you are automatically, with a very, very few exceptions, an American citizen. That's almost entirely a new world phenomenon. Many of the immigration focused countries of the Americas have laws of jus soli based on where you're born. Most of Europe, historically and continuingly today, work off jus sanguinis, where it's the law of your blood. And it doesn't matter whether you were born, in most cases, on French soil. It matters who you were born to. What were your parents French? Were your grandparents French? Um, and the laws about this and what's required for proportion of your bloodline to be French or German or Lithuanian or whatever vary wildly by country. And there's just no way to look at this in a general sense. You have to look explicitly. Sometimes the laws are different if it's on your father or your mother's side that you claim citizenship. Uh, International treaties govern a lot of this. It's actually fairly hard to be born without citizenship, although it does happen sometimes, and you end up stateless. Or it can be very difficult, as in the case of Albanian refugees, where the lists of citizenship were and birth and death records were destroyed in Kosovo in many cases, making it very hard for them to prove where they were born or prove who their parents are legally, and creating significant problems in claiming citizenship elsewhere. So anyway, you don't need to know a ton about that, but particularly for Americans who haven't looked at citizenship issues before, it is very, very easy to make some assumptions that turn out not to be correct about how citizenship is conveyed in a European context. Does that make sense? I mean, that's kind of the one piece I just want you to understand that it works really differently there, and you just shouldn't start assuming things. So this takes us to it's kind of an unusual topic, but in line with our kind of start of the European experiment at the end of the Second World War conversation. One of the things that's really hard to get our head around is what the Second World War meant for population transfers and movement across the European continent. What had been in a pre-war context a somewhat complex set of national boundaries got completely reset, where the Soviets just declared where new borders were. The Allies agreed where the borders of new countries were going to be on their side. And the borders were essentially set by fiat, depending as much on who had control of what, as sometimes traditional national boundaries, linguistic boundaries, ethnic boundaries, etc. Um, and there was a lot of movement to try to match these new borders. Something we just don't talk about very much is in the 1944 to 1950 period, so before the end of the war in Europe, uh, through roughly the 5 years after, somewhere between 5 and 10 million German speaking civilians fled Eastern Europe. And some of these were settlers who had been pushed forward by the Nazi regime into other countries to Germanify other parts of Europe. And some were, long-standing German-speaking minorities in places like Poland and the Czechoslovakia. Um, and it's such a vast movement that we don't really know. The 5 to 10 million are the best available estimates, but when you see an estimate that wide, you know they're just kind of swinging at the number. And this is generally considered the largest population transfer in this amount of time in history. 10 million people, or up to 10 million people, changing where they're standing within Europe in just 5 years. So it's a quiet part of the story of Western Europe in the post-war regime. Similarly, millions of Soviet citizens left Western Europe. So they'd been captured by the Nazis, and 1.5 million Soviet citizens were sent back against their will. And they were treated terribly by the Soviets and often considered traitors for having been captured and sent off to gulags in Siberia and Central Russia. And so again, I mean, just the numbers, my point here really is just these numbers are huge. And in the modern era, we kind of tend to think of Europe as a fairly population stable place. And it certainly has been kind of through the Cold War and the modern era. But just in the last 80 years, these movements are massive. Similarly, something like 2 million Poles were ejected from the borders of the Soviet Union. Another 500,000 Ukrainians were ejected from Poland and pushed into the borders of Ukraine as drawn. And I loved from the Wikipedia article, you just kind of get these little things tucked in when I was checking on the numbers for this a couple of years ago. It just says a further 200,000 Ukrainians left Southeast Poland more or less voluntarily in 1944-45, right? And just the complexities that suggests of that time and place are very profound, right? So that takes us forward into the post-war era. And when we talk about the German Wirtschaftswunder, which means economic miracle, and that's generally considered the period of the 1960s and 70s when the growth of the German economy, or the West German economy in particular, was massive. And we talked previously about kind of this gap in the German population, the millions of working age males or military age males who demographically just weren't there anymore. So to keep up with this economic growth, and it happened other places too, but Germany is kind of the key example. Germany opened up migration for guest workers from Turkey. And they came typically on short-term contracts, and they were allowed to stay as long as they were working. And the idea was that they would come, they would work, they would help build modern Germany, and then they would go home. But that's not quite what happened. The economic growth boomed and boomed and boomed and boomed, and many never left. They stayed, they raised families. There are many Turks in Germany who are on their third or fourth generation living in Germany, mostly third generation. Um, and so today, in Germany, a country of 80 million people, there are between 2.5 and 4 million Turkish citizens, depending on whether you count full or partial Turkish descent. Um, France did something very similar, and they didn't draw from Turkey. They drew from Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Um, so 5.3 million first generation immigrants and 6.5 million French people with at least one immigrant parent. And this again repeats itself in other countries. These are just kind of the two prime examples that we're looking at. It's obviously on a much smaller scale if you look at Portugal or Lithuania. Um, Italy's got its own set of issues, right? In part because these were considered temporary population movements or temporary programs, there wasn't ever particularly an effort to assimilate or integrate or make them citizens. And in fact, Germany still offers a very limited right of citizenship, um, even if you're your second or third generation Turk born in Germany. And indeed, if you wish to attempt to apply for German citizenship, you must give up your Turkish citizenship. They have very limited right of dual citizenship. One of my good friends from high school is, living in Germany. She has 2 German kids, but she can't become a German citizen without giving up her American citizenship, truly giving it up. And that has dissuaded her from becoming German, despite the fact that she's been living there for almost 30 years now. So the point here is that these guest worker programs have created surprisingly large pools, again, by sort of American expectations, of long-term immigrants that nobody has ever had any intent for them to stay, to become local, to become citizens or even true permanent residents, and without any history of assimilation or integration to work off of. And that's created some very powerful um, political challenges and social challenges and identity challenges in these areas. France now offers that if you were born in France, you can become a French citizen at age 18. There's a window of just 2 or 3 years there where you can do that. And they're allowing dual citizenship, so you can maintain the citizenship you got from your parents if you were Moroccan or whatever. But it's notable that that is a significant recent change within the last 10 years or so, and it's one of the most liberal citizenship policies on the European continent. So relative to, again, what we'd expect here in the US, where there's a much more clear pathway if you've become a permanent resident towards becoming a citizen, that largely just doesn't exist within the EU. There are a few complex examples. Ireland, for example, is more than happy to have you claim Irish heritage and get an Irish passport if you have an Irish parent or grandparent. And I just always note to people, if you come from an immigrant history or have recent immigrants on either side of your family, it's often worth going and checking what the requirements of the old country are in terms of granting a passport, particularly if it's from an EU country. As we've seen, that right to live and work anywhere in the EU is very, very powerful. And if that's something that is part of your family history and there's an opportunity to go claim it, I always suggest people kind of at least go take a look and see if there's anything possible for them there. Okay, so this kind of takes us to the modern setup and in the EU, and really kind of the EU driven piece of this. The 2005 EU agreement that lays out the common European asylum system is the framework on which the modern handling of migrants, asylum seekers, um, and people who are classified technically as refugees are based. We need to be really careful about our language when we're dealing with all of these things. Refugee is in general a term for people fleeing conflict or oppression, um, or weather, extreme weather related disasters. The whole point in that case is you're fleeing. In the context of the common European asylum system, refugee has a specific legal meaning that is a legal status granted by the country that you landed in after applying for asylum. So a refugee is, in this context, a successful asylum seeker. And so we just need to be cautious about whether, if you use the word refugee in particular, are you using it in a generic context or using it in the context of the common European asylum system. So migrants are simply people who are moving for any reason. Migrants may be asylum seekers, but asylum seekers are a subcategory of migrants. And asylum seekers are people who have showed up in some way into EU jurisdiction and are applying for asylum, applying for refugee status. So the 2005 agreement sets out minimum standards for processing asylum applications and how people who are granted refugee status is applied. The Dublin regulation, which is part of the common European asylum system, lays out that the state of first arrival must take responsibility for a migrant who shows up there, and that is the only place that their asylum application can be accepted. And this sort of shows the goals. We've talked before where things reflect their initial conditions, right? This shows the goals of the 2005 agreement is they wanted to avoid a situation where asylum seekers were orbiting, going from country to country and submitting applications until they found someone who would say yes, both extending the time between when they apply and when they are accepted or rejected for asylum, or people who were benefits shopping and trying to figure out which country was most likely to be appealing. So the Dublin regulation does a pretty good job of that, of achieving its initial goals. But in the context of later migrant crises, it puts vast obligations on the initial receiving countries. It makes it very difficult for those who are just trying to find a safe place to be to apply because they have to stop in the first country they landed in. And it, in fact, actively encourages smuggling of migrants or even more nefarious trafficking operations where someone is trying to smuggle people into a particular country, either because they believe they have a better chance of getting asylum there, or as part of human trafficking rings. So the common European asylum system was a very reasonable start for where it started, and very quickly started running into trouble. And so this kind of leads us into the 2015, 2016, or 2014, 15, 16 migration crisis, which started in a bunch of different ways, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it largely involves people coming either through Turkey or across the Mediterranean into the EU as part of an attempt to escape a wide variety of unfortunate things in Africa and the Middle East, and putting their lives, at desperate risk as part of that. So here's the 2015 crisis map, and it's showing at the bottom the number of asylum applicants per month, which had been relatively steady and then started ticking up after 2011, and then took a massive spike in 2015. The Eastern Mediterranean route into Greece uh, and through the Western Balkans, and then the out of Libya route, and then of course this sort of continuous ongoing uh, set of routes into Spain and the Spanish islands out of Western Africa. I guess, oh, the other thing I wanted to call out of this is in 2015, the greatest number of country of origin were people fleeing Syria. But even at that point, number two was Kosovo, right? The extent to which Kosovo was and remains kind of an ongoing humanitarian crisis is a real and significant issue. You know, just that's any sense that that's kind of a solved problem should be laid to rest by this chart. Same thing, just as we kind of look at the routes and maps. I just, I'd like you to sort of take away the extent to which at any point that there is a major opportunity to come in across the Black Sea, across the Aegean Sea, from Turkey to Greece, from Libya, North Africa to Sicily, from North Africa to Spain, and out to the Canary Islands. These are all major and continuing routes of access. So what happened in 2014 and 2015 that really changed things? The Syrian war began to really heat up and created a vast number of migrants and refugees. And at the same time, this is kind of a little counterintuitive, Libya finally stabilized enough to be a reasonably safe pathway for migrant flows. When a place is just in utter meltdown, it's not safe to pass through. And while there are Libyan migrants, an awful lot of the people we see coming out of Libya are from much deeper in Africa or the Middle East, transiting through Libya rather than actual Libyans who are coming through. And at the same time, Macedonia, now North Macedonia, just decided they were unwilling to try to keep a firm border and keep immigrants from coming through. And they just declared open borders for transit. As long as you were interested in walking, driving, or riding your bike through Macedonia and not stopping there, they were happy to let immigrants pass through or migrants pass through. The migrant flows through Turkey to Greece have been increasing through 2007, and that was a major pathway. Up until, in 2008, Italy had adopted a policy of forced returns for migrants found at sea. So if the Italian Coast Guard or Navy found you at sea, they would just tow your vessel back to the Libyan coast or wherever they thought you were from and drop you off there. With the collapse of the Libyan government in 2011, that was no longer a reasonable thing to do. Dropping people off on a war-torn shore is just a humanitarian disaster. And particularly with the 2013 Lampedusa shipwreck, where 360 migrants were killed when their ship flooded and went down, the policy of not rescuing in the Mediterranean was no longer valid. And so Italy moved to a search and rescue approach. And interestingly, the more search and rescue they did, the more migrants there were. And I didn't include it in this deck, but there's a really good slide showing that in 2013, most Italian Coast Guard rescues were just off the Sicilian coast. And in 2014, then they're in the middle of the Mediterranean. And by 2015, the Italian Coast Guard is picking people up almost off the shore of Libya, because all smugglers were doing was putting them in rickety rafts, towing them outside Libyan waters into international waters, and then leaving people there for the Italian Coast Guard to come rescue. And so what happened in 2014 is, or 2014 and 2015, is the EU actually denied funding for Italian search and rescue because they were concerned they were doing such a good job of it that what they were in fact creating was, through a moral hazard process, a pull that they were rescuing so many people at sea that it was becoming more attractive to attempt to smuggle yourself across the Mediterranean because you felt like the Italians would come and get you, right? And this creates a real problem for us when we're talking about these migration issues. By doing the humanitarian thing of rescuing migrants found at sea rather than just leaving them or towing them back, Italy, in fact, succeeded in making it much more attractive to put yourself at risk at sea in the Mediterranean, right? And this is just something, the reason I kind of wanted to talk this through a little bit is it really creates a challenge for those of us who are trying to be policymakers. Is the thing we're attempting to create actually doing what we hoped it would do? Or are there unintended consequences that create the exact opposite of what we were hoping to achieve? As part of the Syrian civil war and meltdown and the ongoing pressure on Greece in particular, and the large number of migrants coming through, Germany violated the Dublin Agreement or the Dublin Regulation and simply declared in 2015 an open arms policy. If you could make it to Germany, they would take you. And this created a now massive pull through Greece, through Macedonia, to a lesser extent through Hungary, um, of asylum seekers trying to make it to Germany. Over 1 million arrived in 2015 alone. And again, Germany is a country of 80 million people. Having 1 million new asylum seekers show up at your door is, I mean, it's a massive shift. Hard to overstate. So by 2015, Greece overtakes Italy as the focus of arrivals. They count 1.82 million arrivals in 2015. They think that's about 1 million people. They often got double counted in Greece or Croatia or Hungary. That's 4 times what the 2014 numbers. I mean, the scale of this, again, is just unimaginable. It's real, and they can't figure out how to stop this now that there has been this massive creation of a pull and open arms and open doors and open Macedonian border. It's also worth noting that while some of these are families with, parents and children coming through, this remains a difficult, dangerous, and expensive journey, and the numbers are overwhelmingly weighted towards young men who are coming through. And that's just, whatever you kind of think about that, it's just a demographic fact that is a heavy weighting on the demographic, which then causes some integration problems that are different than if it was for a more controlled migration, intentional families where people were set up with hosts and other things. Things begin to slow down in March 2016 when the EU prevails on Macedonia to close their borders, and actually, in this case, they literally built a wall. This trafficking routes, again, just kind of shows the complexity of the routes, and there's this kind of weird transition into Denmark and Spain. Denmark is notoriously not immigrant friendly and started doing things like seizing anything you had in value over, I think, 1,500 euros for asylum applicants there for their own safety. But in fact, it was, I think pretty hard to argue it wasn't a punitive measure to give you a reason to not come to Denmark. This map, I think, is really worth taking a little time with on your own time. And we tend to talk about these migration patterns as a Syrian issue or a Moroccan issue or a Libyan issue. And while there's some truth to that, it's also not the whole story. I think you really need to kind of look deep into the continents behind those points of exit to understand a little more how all this is working and how it's coming from, right? So things really changed here, and this kind of leads into our larger conversation about Turkey with the 2016 EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan. Um, and so the setup is that Turkey got 3 billion euros, and then they got another 3 billion in 2018. They agreed to accept returned migrants who had come through Turkey, to send them back and essentially do a one-for-one swap of an undocumented migrant for one who was in fact accepted as an asylum seeker or as an asylum applicant, to kind of balance that out. And one of the agreements was that the EU would provide visa-free admission to the EU for Turkish citizens as part of this deal. And at that point, there were about 3.5 million migrants in Turkey who just stayed. They're still there today. The number is about 3.6 million, depending on how you want to count it, with a 97% reduction in migration into the EU. So still people fleeing Syria and the surrounding conflict, but incenting Turkey to hold on to those 3.5 million migrants and work with them and house them, and summer in camps and a variety of other settings. Um, it was a big win for the EU by convincing Turkey to take on a major problem for them. The 2017 agreement between Italy and the sort of slowly growing Libyan government did essentially the same thing by trying to move all these problems off EU borders and EU border states and into the states of departure. Now pickups off the Libyan coast are being run by the Libyan Coast Guard, which is funded by Italy and the EU. And Libya is now accepting migrant returns. If Italy rescues a migrant or a migrant vessel, Libya will take those back and handle it ashore. The EU is sort of working on its internal agreements. There's technically agreements in place for voluntary cooperation to distribute migrants. They're funding reception centers in Africa and the Balkans for pre-processing of asylum applications. There's funding for Turkey and Libya, trying to support Italy more. There's a 2019 agreement for France and Italy to take migrants rescued at sea. But there still are not sort of a comprehensive agreement among all 27 members about what to do with migrants. Technically, all the countries have agreed to accept them and take their fair share, whatever that means. But Hungary has taken very small numbers, just a couple thousand. Denmark has also taken just, I think, I haven't checked in a while, 1,500 or so. And so the large states are disproportionately carrying the burdens of these, as are the arrival states of Greece and Italy. So this really hasn't been fully addressed at all. Just to give you some idea how big an impact, first the closures of the Macedonian border, and then the EU-Turkey deal, particularly for Greece. The arrival numbers for Greece fall to almost nothing after the EU-Turkey deal.
So what we've seen as we look forward in this process is this huge peak in the 2015-2016 region. The solution that came out of the 2017 deals with Turkey and a quieting down. And then a relatively quiet and manageable period through the pandemic period and 2020, 2021, 2022. And then again, starting to see a significant rise as we roll into 2023 and 2024. We don't have full 2024 or early 2025 data yet. But what we're seeing is significant increases across the various pathways of people flowing into the EU, particularly through the Mediterranean routes. Turkey continues to do a pretty good job of holding the line on holding immigrants, particularly from Syria. and that region in. Um, but the flows are very real. And if you take a look at this chart at Mediterranean and sea and land arrivals, we see huge numbers coming out of Syria relative to the total Syrian population. Obviously, this is fairly modest, but in terms of influx into the EU, about 30% and just over 600,000 are represented as coming from Syria, 14%, 300,000 from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and then a sharp, sharp drop down to the larger world with an interesting, strong presence of North Africa and Horn of Africa countries um, in here, and then some Central African countries, and an interesting group from Bangladesh showing up. Not a particularly large number, but given the distance involved, it's a little surprising to see them so high on the list. Anyway, what the story that's being told here is of a global pull towards the European Union, not just from neighboring areas, but deep, deep into Africa, deep into the Middle East, deep into the Indian subcontinent. That the economic strength and cultural strength and social policies of the EU are really pulling people from great distances. It's a tremendously attractive destination, and in some ways more welcoming regimes than the United States is offering for immigrants and those who can prove a refugee status. So, more than I think many people would have expected after the changes from the crisis in the teen years, Europe continues to be a very powerful immigration pull destination. This is just a reiteration of the Mediterranean situation and the flows we're seeing here. Relatively small numbers through Turkey, as I mentioned. Cyprus is seeing some, quite a bit of landing in Greece, both out of North Africa and some from Turkey. But the North African route out of Libya, out of Morocco, out of Algeria, out of Tunisia, into Spain and Italy is proving both a very, very powerful connection route and one that's difficult to stop and interdict. The Libya process, as we talked about a little bit earlier, did quite a good job of reducing outflows out of Libya, but the Algerian, Morocco, and Tunisian routes are considerably harder to manage. They're more diffuse. They're taking place in more of a smuggling context than just a sending migrants out to sea context, and really are proving considerable difficulties in terms of managing that flow and reducing it from over the long term. It's also worth noting, it's not on this map, that the UK, while not obviously part of the EU today, remains a surprisingly attractive destination for migrants looking for a new life. Given the geographic challenges of reaching it, its separation by water from with the English Channel, I'm always a little surprised to see how many people are continuing onward and looking at the UK as a specific target for their migration plan. It's impossible to overstate how much the Ukrainian situation and the conflict there has changed what's gone on in European migration policy. The chart here is from 2022, and it's really showing what was going on in just the first few months of the war. And the thing I really want to emphasize is how abruptly this changed. From the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, illegally and unprovoked, obviously, the numbers of Ukrainian refugees flowing into the EU unbelievably quickly were huge. So even just February to October, a little over 6 months, There were 4.5 million registrations for temporary protection in the EU, which was a regime created specifically for this situation that offered substantial protections and status, including the right to work, the right for housing, access to medical aid, and a wide variety of other services were offered throughout the EU. Most of this landed, at least initially, in Poland and Romania for just geographic reasons, but then the process began of refugees moving more deeply into the EU and finding places to settle that were not quite as crowded and overwhelmed as particularly Eastern Poland was at the time. So the chart just shows these phenomenal 6 months numbers: 4.4 million registrations for temporary protection, of which 2.4 million were women, pushing 750,000 Ukrainian children who are moving in and needed schooling. And that's the number that were already fully adopted at that time, October 2022, into the school systems of national member states. Because of this temporary protection regime offering so many benefits, there's a relatively small number of asylum applications that would lead to permanent residence. And I think that's part of the beauty of the temporary protection regime that the EU came up with and put into place, is to help keep people out of the asylum regime and thus, hopefully, at least in the EU's view, being in the EU for a relatively small number of years and preparing for a return to Ukraine. Obviously, as the situation drags on, it becomes considerably more complicated. It's worth noting that on the sheet it shows 12.1 million entries into the EU from Ukraine and Moldova, of which 10.5 million were Ukrainian nationals. The border is heavily trafficked. These are not just one-way transits. There's a lot of back and forthing, people who are coming and looking for safety or an improved situation outside of Ukraine and in the EU, and are either finding that it did work or finding that it didn't particularly work, returning to Ukraine, flowing back and forth as the situation in Ukraine changes, and working on their stability. It's just a lot of motion and a tremendous amount to keep track of as people try to figure out what is a reasonable situation for themselves, their families, their kids, their work. The numbers are just staggering. So UNHCR lists about 5.8 million Ukrainian refugees across Europe. That number includes 1.3 million refugees who left Ukraine and ended up in Russia. Some of those are sort of Russian speaking and Russian sympathetic Ukrainians who are coming from war zones. They're just as much displaced as Ukrainian speaking and Ukrainian, empathetic or politically leaning. And then some of that group is also Ukrainians who were pulled or forced out of Ukrainian areas and deeper into Russia unwillingly. For the UNHCR list, they're just kind of all grouped together. But the thing I want to emphasize is just how complicated this situation ends up being. About 90% of the total refugee group that's in the EU is women and children. And it's also worth noting that there are a tremendous number of what UNHCR calls internally displaced people who are either stuck in conflict zones and can't get out, or don't have any place else to go within Ukraine. And so they are not necessarily, there's actually two separate groups. There's internally displaced people and then people who are stranded inside Ukraine who can't move forward. I should have listed those separately. The EU Temporary Protection Order offers residency, access to housing, social welfare assistance, medical care, legal guardianship and safe placement for unaccompanied children and teenagers, access to education for children and teenagers. One of the biggest surprises for a lot of people was this offered direct access to the labor market, the right to work for those who are given this opportunity, subject to EU countries' labor market policies. Access to banking services, so they're allowed to open bank accounts, the right to move to another EU country before the issuance of a residence permit. We talked a little bit about the rules requiring new arrivals to stay in their country of arrival and for that country to deal with them. The temporary protection order does away with that and allows it to just move forward and allows people to move wherever within the EU they can figure out a place that works for them, which really helps to spread the load and means so that Poland and Romania in particular aren't quite so overwhelmed, although obviously they are and will remain the frontline states. And then the opportunity to move freely within the EU country for travel or job seeking for 90 days within a 180-day period, which is very similar to the normal Schengen protocol, after a residence permit in the host EU country is issued. So that allows for travel, which is another thing that the asylum regime really kept locked down and doesn't allow asylum seekers to do until they receive formal asylum status. So today we've got a really kind of complicated situation going on. We've got 3.5 million Syrian and other refugees being held in Turkey, not allowed to move forward into the EU by Turkish authorities, and that's a tremendous source of leverage politically for Turkey, is their willingness to continue holding on to housing and feeding these very large groups of refugees rather than having them move forward further into the EU. We've got extensive ongoing migrant flows at sea. Italy, Spain, and Greece are the frontline countries there. There's significant strain on the agreements with Turkey and Libya. And it's quite helpful that asylum applications are largely handled before applicants arrive in the EU. But that's probably not a tremendous long-term solution. We shouldn't treat that as a solved problem. The length and severity of the Ukrainian war is unknown. It's clearly dragging on, and it's dragging on in a way that allows some of the displaced people and refugees to return to their homes in safer portions of Ukraine. But also, as the emphasis of the fighting changes and attack patterns change, there are new, smaller scale flows, both within Ukraine and from Ukraine into the EU. The real long-term question, the true long-term policy challenge, is that it's very clear that regional and global conflicts, humanitarian crises, climate-related crises with water and food, are all really driving significant migrant flows towards the EU. And the EU is still working on adapting into a universe in which they are a major humanitarian and economic pull for migrants from across the world. How that's going to work out remains to be seen. One of the challenges we've seen with integration of migrants that came in large groups in 2015, 2016, 2017 is these groups are increasingly making up large portions of the labor force in many EU countries. You know, they're in significant percentages of the population, particularly in Germany, to a lesser extent in Austria and France, and they don't have a clear pathway towards citizenship. They don't have a clear pathway towards voting, and so this sort of break between their economic integration, which is high and increasing rapidly, and their political, social, and cultural integration, which is relatively low and probably not growing, really ends up being a challenge and is one of the things leading to, in several countries, the ascent of substantial right-wing parties. Both France and Austria and Germany are seeing very powerful showings for right and far right groups in their own political spectrum, in part in response to the increasing visible presence and economic sort of either presence or competition, depending on how you want to look at it, of these migrant groups. So far, that hasn't been a huge issue for the Ukrainian refugees, but as this continues and those groups begin to settle and they become a more long-term presence rather than a temporary one, it'll be fascinating and presumably quite challenging to see how that develops. Um, how should the EU manage this in both a functional and humane way? What's the right path forward, and how does that work with the obligations of EU member states under the European Union treaties and their agreements, under global obligations for asylum seekers, and just functionally in terms of their own immigration, integration, and citizenship policies? This is a tremendously challenging and volatile area for the EU and its member states. And while there's considerable EU cooperation on emergency and emergent migration issues, ultimately questions like citizenship and how citizenship is defined and who is offered citizenship, the EU leaves to the individual member states. So rather than one large overarching European solution, we're almost certainly going to see sort of a piecemeal, one country at a time, individual set of solutions on the citizenship front and what it means to really sort of become not just a resident, but in what cases, if any, these groups of migrants will be allowed to really become a proper citizen and set up a long-term situation uh, in their destination countries. And we'll just have to see how that kind of plays out and the direction that ends up taking. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this discussion. Thank you for joining us for this European Union Governance and Policy Challenges lecture, co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies.